You are live.
We're live. Okay. Senate Education Committee on February 28th, 1:30. Today we're actually, I think what we're doing is kind of picking up a couple of bits of testimony that we had originally scheduled for a week and a half or so ago. And because of joint hearings and other things that we're doing, we kind of got bumped, including, so we bumped Jay Nichols and Sue Sabowski. But now they're able to be here with us today. And to really just give us their reaction to the administration proposal. I think you both be tackling it a little bit differently, but why don't you just come up, Jay?
I have Sue and Phil are.
Okay, do they want, whichever way you want to do it? Sue.
They were having me, feel free to have me go. I'm in no hurry.
Okay, then we'll go with Sue. We'll go with Sue and Phil. So start off by introducing yourselves for the record. Now, actually, I know Sue does. Phil, you may not know everybody in the room. Do you? Okay, you're muted, by the way.
Yeah,
okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So we have a couple of members not able to be with us, but on my immediate right is
Dave Weeks, representing Rutland County.
So Seth Baumgart's from the Bennington Senate District.
Terry Williams from Rutland.
Steve Heffernan, Addison County District.
So, give a fairly vague introduction, but take it away.
Thank you very much, Chair Baumgarts. I'm Sue Sabowski, and I am the Executive Director for the Vermont School Boards Association. And I am joined today by Dr. Phil Gore, who is currently the Chief Learning Officer for the Idaho School Boards Association. And prior to moving to Idaho, Dr. Gore served as the Director of Board Services for the Vermont School Boards Association. He's also served as a Division Director for the Texas Association of School Boards. He's worked for the National School Boards Association and the Washington State School Directors Association. Dr. Gore is the author of Improving School Board Effectiveness, a Balanced Governance Approach. Dr. Gore's work in Vermont, combined with work in other states and nationally, provides him with important perspectives to share with the committee on scale and governance. I'll start with a general overview of the district sizes and school board sizes in the United States, and then I'll ask Dr. Gore to provide some perspective for you. And I did file written testimony with the committee. There are more than 13,000 geographically defined school districts in the United States. Most current school districts are for K through 12 education, but some are elementary or secondary only. And this number, 13,000, does not include charter schools or private or religious schools. A 2022 Ballotpedia analysis of school districts in the United States found that every state has at least one school district, with most states having more than 100. So states with the fewest number of districts are Hawaii has 1, and then Delaware has 19, Nevada with 20, and Maryland with 24. States with the highest number of districts are Texas with 1,022, California with 977, and Illinois with 853. And it is important to note that these numbers may have changed slightly in the last 3 years because the landscape of school districts is constantly in flux as new districts are created and existing districts are merged or eliminated over time. I'll talk just briefly now about school board size. In terms of school board size, the range of 5 to 13 members per board is fairly typical across the United States. Surveys conducted in 2018 by the National School Boards Association showed that in 2010, boards with 5 seats were most common, and 8 years later in 2018, the typical school board contained 7 individuals. It is important to note that while this 5 to 13 range is fairly typical across the United States, there is no universally accepted ideal size for a school board. The effectiveness of a board depends on various factors beyond just the number of members. Factors such as board member backgrounds, adherence to best practices, small group dynamics, and the ability to collaborate with the superintendent, these all play a crucial role in a board's impact on district performance. This brings us to district performance, specifically student achievement, and whether and how a board has an impact on it. So to jump ahead to the conclusion, the answer is yes. Research concludes that the way school boards govern does indeed affect district level performance. How do we know this? One of the richest data sets available is the Lighthouse Study conducted by the Iowa Association of School Boards. The Iowa Association of School Boards conducted ongoing research on effective school boards and their role in advancing student achievement. The studies identified characteristics of school boards of districts with higher levels of student achievement and how they may affect their district's performance. Their conclusion: school board actions are a key part of a culture of improvement, and school boards can create conditions that promote student learning. The Center of Public Education, the research arm of the National School Boards Association, conducted a meta-analysis of 10 studies and reports on school board leadership, including several based on the Iowa Lighthouse Study. The result is a report entitled 8 Characteristics of Effective School Boards. One of the most reputable research-informed lists of attributes of effective school boards, the 8 characteristics, is a structure commonly referenced on the national level and when researchers are studying school boards. One of these characteristics that I'll focus on today is a collaborative relationship with staff and the community, and a strong communication structure to inform and engage both internal and external stakeholders in setting and achieving district goals. The Lighthouse Study is particularly relevant in conveying this. The research found that in high-achieving districts, board members maintained strong and open lines of communication with the superintendent, staff, and one another. They gathered information from multiple sources, including the superintendent, curriculum directors, principals, teachers, and external experts. While the superintendent played a central role in sharing information, they were not the sole source. Furthermore, findings and research were consistently shared among all board members, ensuring that decision-making was well informed. In contrast, board members in low-achieving districts expressed concerns about uneven access to information. Some members reported feeling excluded from key discussions, leading to a fragmented understanding of district priorities. High-achieving districts also demonstrated a strong commitment to community engagement. Their board members could provide specific examples of outreach efforts and actively promoted involvement. Staff in these districts described the boards as supportive and respectful, noting that board members listened to their concerns and valued their input. One key strategy was to hold post-board meetings to brief teachers and administrators on policy decisions. By contrast, school boards in lower performing districts frequently cited challenges in communication and outreach. They often attributed low parent involvement to a lack of interest, yet they could identify only limited efforts to foster engagement. Many board members expressed frustration with the community's lack of participation, but believed there was little they could do to change it. Within the district, staff members from these lower performing schools often reported little to no interaction with their board members. I'm going to pause now and ask Dr. Gore to provide any comments he has on the Lighthouse Study, and specifically on the ability of 25 school board members serving the entire state of Vermont to achieve the characteristic I spoke about earlier: collaborative relationship with staff and the community, and a strong communication structure to inform and engage both internal and external stakeholders in setting and achieving district goals. So I'll turn it over to you now, Dr. Gore.
Thank you, Sue. It is an honor to join you in the Vermont Senate Education Committee today. Sue just shared some of the most salient research to consider in relation to public school governance. I had the privilege of participating in the Lighthouse project that she spoke about in phases 2 and 3. The primary investigator, Dr. Mary Della Gardell, was both a school board member in one district and a principal in another at the same time that she began that research. Mary was adamantly committed to the importance of community engagement, but could not prove the relationship statistically between a board engaging the community and student achievement improving or declining. Since her passing, however, other researchers, including Ivan Lawrenson and Bill McCaw from Montana, have been able to show a statistical relationship between school boards engaging their community, and I might add, in the board's work. So that of setting, identifying vision, values, long-term goals for the school system, and the likelihood that student achievement is improving overall, while at the same time, gaps are closing. Now, importantly, this is not the type of community engagement of parents, caregivers, and families participating in their schools. It's not about volunteers in a classroom. It's the community engagement with students, staff, families engaging in the board or with the board in governance. We mean that the board is establishing values, vision, and goals that are collaboratively set with the greater community. When the community participates in these governance activities together with the board, again, student achievement and gaps in achievement are more likely to be improving. Vermont has a long tradition of local governance of its public schools. It is highly more likely to support improved outcomes than more remote, regionalized, or centralized governance of Vermont public schools. The closer governance is to the schools and students, the more likely that the governance is representing the vision and values that the local community has for its schools. Arguably, there is room for a balance between community representation and efficiencies of scale. It is hard to know what the ideal number of school districts would be for Vermont. Consideration needs to be given both to the economies of scale, local and regional differences in both expectations and resources, and opportunities for sharing of best practices across the state. While there's always room for improvement, state lawmakers and public education providers must carefully explore a balance in any mandated change in governance structures. While it might be difficult to stipulate what the ideal number of school districts would be for Vermont, that number is much larger than 5. Back to you, Sue.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to turn our attention now to the school advisory committees or councils that are part of the education transformation proposal. The concept of school advisory committees or councils is not new. Dr. Gore will speak to some of their history and effectiveness in a few minutes. But first, I would like to take an example from the school district of Philadelphia. In June 2016, the school district adopted a policy to create school advisory councils, which are peer-elected teams composed of family members, the school principal, teachers or other school-based staff, students for schools with grades 7 through 12, and community members. The policy was designed with the intent of increasing the involvement of families and the community in the educational process. The SAC's mission was to be a catalyst for change in schools to support student achievement. However, over the past several years, the SACs in Philadelphia schools have struggled with their mission. These challenges stem from a lack of cohesive policies, procedures, and practices related to their operations. They have had difficulty with recruiting family members to join the SAC, resulting in unfilled seats. It is worth noting that this new structure requires additional resources. For instance, at the central office, Philadelphia has a school district office of family and community engagement to support the work of the SACs. It also requires additional resources at the school building level. For instance, it demands significant time from the principal, who is required to be a member of the SAC. And as the school leader, the principal is responsible for ensuring the SAC's creation and that it meets all of its duties throughout the year. Other questions and issues related to SACs that would need to be addressed here in Vermont are listed in my written testimony. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll just mention a few. There would need to be bylaws to define the roles and responsibilities of the SAC, its size, its membership, its structure, how its members are chosen, if that's by an application process, and if so, what's the timing and the selection criteria, and if it's by election, who runs that election and what are the procedures? Are their meetings subject to the open meeting law? There's a host of questions. The overarching question about the SAC, which may be the most essential one though, is how would the chains of authority and accountability be impacted by this new structure? In Vermont's educational governance system today, authority and accountability are clear. Authority originates in the community, specifically the residents or voters, and it flows directly to the school board. The board then delegates authority to the superintendent, who in statute is called the CEO of the district. Superintendent in turn delegates authority to their administrative team, and it continues from there to staff. Accountability flows in the opposite direction from the staff back up through the administrative team, the superintendent, the board, and finally to the voters in the community. Where would the SAC fit in the chain of authority and the chain of accountability? Before I move on to summarize the VSBA's response to Governor Scott's education transformation proposal, I'm going to pause here to see if Dr. Gore has any comments related to the history and effectiveness of school advisory committees or councils.
Thank you, Sue. I served on a school board in the Seattle area from 2002 through 2007. And the school district where I served was historically a dairy farm community that had a large influx of sort of the Seattle sprawl, but particularly people working in the tech industry. And my district was greatly challenged at the time I joined the board between the tension between what the historic traditional members of the community wanted for their schools and what the new people moving in wanted for their schools. The tension was so strong that we ended up in the Wall Street Journal on the front page, top of the fold, talking about this conflict between a desire for more career and technical education pathways and more college-bound pathways at the time. The intriguing piece of this was we had site-based councils, as they were called and are commonly referred to in the literature. Our district had started them in the 1980s, and the challenge that I had experienced that relates partly to this community conflict was that over time, site-based councils or advisory committees, they devolve into something of convenience. Number one, as I know Jay Nichols can share, it becomes an extra burden for a principal to have to manage, particularly when they are stipulated as the chair or the leader of those councils or committees. It also becomes over time for those involved, how do they make this simpler? How do they make it quicker, more efficient, if you will? One of the ways that my district principals had done that was to simply appoint staff members who happen to be parents or have other roles in the community and sort of check multiple boxes at the same time. Yes, we have parents, caregivers, community volunteers, and by the way, they happen to also be staff members. Now, that was a logical step for someone to take because these were the people on the same schedule, already in the building where this site-based council would meet, and frankly, could allow the school system to kind of buffer themselves from community input. That had led to that practice, that devolution, if you will, to the local, in our case, high school building in their site-based council, had led to the conflicts that landed us on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The disconnect between what staff wanted and what other community members would have wanted for their schools, curriculum-wise and outcome-wise. So, I've had some experience with this. There's a lot of literature that points to the problems on site-based councils or advisory councils. But I would encourage just a lot of thought about the extra burden it becomes for a principal to manage, and suggest that may be removed from what the community actually wants from their schools. Sue?
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to a sort of a preliminary summary of VSBA's response to Governor Scott's proposal. I don't really have time today to go into depth on a response to the entire 176-page bill, but I will provide you with some preliminary thoughts from VSBA. The VSBA board met in mid-February, and most of the meeting was dedicated to reviewing and analyzing the governor's education transformation proposal as it existed at that time. As indicated earlier in my testimony, the VSBA has significant concerns about the governance piece of the governor's proposal, which decreases the number of school districts from 119 to 5. As you have heard today, Vermont's long tradition of local governance of its public schools is highly more likely to support improved student outcomes than more remote regionalized governance of Vermont public schools. And 5 school boards would not have a meaningful connection to local communities' visions and values for their schools. Additionally, the governor's proposal will fundamentally and dramatically change school board service in the state. Vermont school board members come from all walks of life, and they have a very proud history of nonpartisan volunteer service for their local communities. This change would politicize school boards by reducing the number of board members statewide from 900 to 25, which is less than the total number of senators who serve Vermont. These highly competitive races will introduce money into public education governance in a manner never before seen in our state. On top of that, this change will exclude those who don't have the ability to survive on a part-time position, making school board service an opportunity reserved for the retired or the privileged. Regarding the funding piece of the governor's proposal, the VSBA priorities I provided to the Senate Education Committee earlier in the session still stand. Any funding changes must focus on students by providing sufficient funds to support equitable, high-quality education in Vermont schools. Superintendents and business managers have raised significant concerns about the sufficiency of the base funding amount proposed by Governor Scott. Further investigation, data, and modeling are necessary in order to show the true impact of the proposed foundation formula. Beyond the formula itself, we are baffled by the lack of measures to address the cost drivers behind the increase in education spending. As noted in earlier testimony to this committee, the cost of public school employees' health insurance exceeds $300 million per year. The cost increased by 16% in FY25 and 12% in FY26. The cost of health insurance premiums and health reimbursement arrangements are included in school district budgets and paid by Vermont taxpayers. These costs are consuming a larger and larger portion of Vermont school budgets. In 2018, they made up less than 10% of school budgets, and fast forward a few years and it's now around 15%. If they continue to grow at the current pattern, it will make up 20% of school budgets in a few years. To deal with this issue, school boards have to hold the line on the remaining parts of the budget, and the bottom line is healthcare is squeezing out other education initiatives. Moving on to the quality piece of the governor's proposal, VSBA opposes the governor's proposal to move all rulemaking authority under the Agency of Education. As noted in the VSBA task force report, which was submitted previously to the Senate Education Committee as testimony and submitted again today, the agency is not providing the data necessary to inform decision-making now and underperforms in fulfilling its statutory responsibilities, including policy execution and compliance monitoring. Concentrating more authority in an agency of education that is unable to do the work it is currently responsible for is ill-advised. We support revitalizing the State Board of Education with a governance structure, independence, and resources necessary to meet its statutory obligations and to provide effective leadership and oversight. A stable, high-functioning, and nonpartisan State Board of Education is essential for ensuring continuity of education leadership in Vermont and reestablishing public trust through vision and accountability. We strongly urge the Senate Education Committee to hear testimony from the chair of the VSBA Task Force on Collaboration to Benefit All Students and VSBA's president on the task force report, which I have included as part of our testimony today. And then at the end of our written testimony, I did provide a chart that has a summary of the recommendations from that report, if you want to take a look at those before reading the entire report. In conclusion, public education is the core of our strong communities. It's critically important for a healthy democracy. And given the current national climate, it is more important than ever to support our public schools by funding them in a sustainable way. This will involve hard choices to achieve efficiency and scale. VSBA is ready to contribute constructively to making those choices in the Vermont context. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you. Questions from the committee? Yes, Senator Heffernan.
Thanks. What is the average district size for our size state? If you look at other states, I think that are fairly the same population. Do you have a number of how many districts they have?
Do you have any information, Phil, about that?
So Wyoming would be the closest size state, and they have not organized by county yet. I can speak to Idaho, which has recently passed 2 million people, so slightly twice as big. We have 115 school districts in the state of Idaho, so much larger geographically. We also have about 75 publicly funded charter schools. So total LEAs is around 185 to 190. It varies greatly, as Sue mentioned in her remarks, the way that states are configured. Not only is Nevada configured by county for school districts, but Florida is primarily, and I believe Maryland is primarily as well.
So just to have a discussion here, we've heard testimony making the opposite case, not surprisingly, that's what this is about.
Sure.
But making the case that larger districts, and again, what that means, and you alluded to this, Dr. Gore, that finding the right size is the key. It's not necessarily that the way we do it now is right, but finding the right size is the key. But I made by having a larger scale, you can achieve consistency across the district, a greater ability to deliver specialized services, be it for special ed or otherwise. And if you've got very small districts and small SUs, they can't have the staff to deliver those services as well as you can if you have a somewhat larger district. We heard testimony about the fact that in a small district in SUs, it's very hard to have a bench, and one person leaves and there's panic because there's nobody to take their place. And if you have enough people, and if you got a team of 5, kind of all able to do it, and one leaves, you're in better shape than if you are. So, so I guess that was kind of some of the key things that they were at work that we sat. I think it was a joint hearing we had with the House Education Committee, and they had some I can't remember the gentleman's name, but making the case that scale of about 12,000 to 15,000 students is about right for all of those reasons. And just wanted to hear your response to that, give you a chance to say why, maybe you partially agree, maybe you partially disagree, just give us your reaction to that. And I think, by the way, the other thing is consistent with that, with the larger districts, you've got more ability to have larger schools to consolidate resources that way as well, and therefore have, to the extent we have a teacher shortage, a teacher shortage, that you can consolidate and get more kids in classrooms and be more efficient. So all of those things, and just want to get your reaction to that.
I would love to speak to that. I do believe, and we can provide some sources to back this up, that number one, there's no ideal size school district. I have worked with school districts with less than 20 students, and I've worked with school districts with well over 200,000. And there are multiple challenges at both ends. I believe we can supply you with some resources to support that the ideal school district size may be somewhere between 2,500 students and 5,000 students. In fact, somewhere around 4,000. The efficiencies of scale are lost above 5,000 students. The amount of overhead, and I'll borrow a few unkind words, bureaucracy, red tape, extra rules, procedures, regulations that start to come into place in a district over 5,000 become non-productive. And I believe that bears out all across the country. I worked for 7.5 years in Texas. The median sized school district in Texas is less than 1,000 students. While they have some of the largest cities in the US by far, the predominant landscape of Texas is, shall we say, tumbleweed and a handful of dirt roads. So it depends on so many factors. And I think one of the things to consider is that when you consolidate, all the history across the US bears this out, when you consolidate, communities close. So the unintended consequence, and the reality is, and I've witnessed this firsthand as well as read other studies on this topic. In 1900, we had about 120,000 school districts in the country. And with the push for modern business efficiencies, and then ultimately the creation of the school bus, consolidation has become very favorable, desirable, and for the reasons you mentioned. Comprehensive high schools may have a sweet spot of a number of students. I would suggest that that's probably not more than 1,000, because you run into additional problems when you get too large of high schools. I've worked with school districts that have high schools that are 5,000 to 7,000 students. And they have a whole host of undesirable problems and bureaucracy that, would be unfathomable in comparison to what you have in Vermont.
Of course, that's probably a challenge we won't have to meet.
Right. But, so there's an extreme at both ends, right? I just think, again, it's noteworthy to know wherever schools are closed, communities often close quickly thereafter. And again, I've witnessed that firsthand. So it's just, it's one of the things you need to wrestle with. Obviously, I don't need to tell you the state of Vermont is mountainous with streams and rivers and mudslides and a little bit of snow on occasion. There's so many different factors to consider when you think of consolidating. Will we be able to get our students there, our staff there safely, enough days out of the school year? And what other barriers may there be, again, caused by weather or other natural formations, barriers, if you will? What makes sense? It's not 5 districts, and it's probably not 12,000 student districts either.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for both of you for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I will see you. Welcome, by the way, to stay on and listen to your friend, Mr. Nichols.
Hey, Phil.
I'd love to hear Jay speak.
Been seeing you for a while. Hope you're well.
I'm well, thank you.
can't believe he leaves Vermont to go there. It's crazy. There's 48 districts in Wyoming. You asked my question. I talked to their executive director maybe 2-3 weeks ago, and there's about 2,000 kids, I think he said. Okay, well, is that right?
They're also geographically much bigger state.
10 times the size.
They are huge.
Yeah.
They're 10 times their size.
So for the record, Jay Nichols, Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association. Thanks for having me today. But for my current tenure of 8 years in this role, I was a principal and superintendent for over 20 years. I served in choice districts, non-choice districts, and as a superintendent with both in the same system. Additionally, I've taught ed finance and education leadership at the graduate level, and I've decided to provide my testimony today basically in the manner of bullet points. And I'm trying to look at this from education finance issue. I realize you guys aren't going to do as much with finance, but the Senate being such a small body, all 30 of you are going to have important say in that. So I do want to touch on that some. Then governance, of course, and then practical impacts on students. So first, please just consider these as high-level comments on the governor's transformation plan. Many of these comments I did share with House Ways and Means and Health Education already. And I do want to actually publicly applaud the governor. I've done this in several locations, coming forward with a plan, helping us to have these important conversations, many of which are long overdue, including conversations around scale and student opportunity. Though I don't agree with all the thoughts, you're going to hear that in a minute. I appreciate that he put the plan out there, so we have a starting point to work from. So I would start by saying, first, do no harm. Don't rush into financial decisions without looking at potential unintended consequences. I know you all know this. We're seeing right now in the current environment, some places that we already would say are right size. I think you may have had the CDU principal in testifying the other day.
Yeah.
And the superintendent there is a good friend of mine, he's on my board. They're making cuts now, and they've already got class sizes that, and all the research says what they should have. So we need to be careful about those unintended consequences. Equity is equity is key. When you do a foundation formula, talking to my friends in Alaska, we actually have 2 principals from Alaska serving Vermont now. They're partners, and they left Alaska partly because of the foundation formula that was put into place there. And what they did there was they set a number that people thought was pretty reasonable and had a lot of support across the state. But then what happened is something like 9 or 10 years in a row or 11 years in a row, they did not increase the base amount because they were having some tough financial times, and some of the towns were having booming oil economic times. So they just allowed those towns to go ahead and raise more on the local property tax, where they had the old grand list system similar to what we had before Brigham's decision. So what happened is the rich kept getting richer, and the poor places just kept cutting, and parents fled those poor places that could. And it's caused a lot of problems. So we just want to be mindful of that. Formulas that are looked at in every legislation cycle can be hostage to the political whims of the day. And as I just mentioned, economic context, a formula would need to have an appropriate base education amount. I know Emily Kornheiser's all over this in Ways and Means, but important to realize, and some type of inflationary index that's built into the law so that future General Assemblies just follow that, and you're constantly making sure you're staying up with inflation. Additionally, do not increase the amount of money going to school districts before fixing the cost drivers, such as health insurance increases, which I think BFA just mentioned, any unfunded mandates, and scale and governance issues. If you just lower the amount you spend in ed funding, I think you're going to hurt kids. The idea that we could cut nearly $2 million from the current system, and I'm not saying the governor's saying this without doing anything, doesn't make sense. If we just took a foundation formula, popped it on to what we're doing right now, without any governance changes or any scale type changes, we would end up in a system where we're actually cutting services from kids, and our kids need services, right? So for us, that would be a non-starter. And again, I want to mention some places that are already really taking strong steps to right size are getting to the bones, and they're going to cut some significant programs if we're not careful what we do. It also concerns me that we may end up with a system in which a base education amount may not really be enough to sufficiently fund the system. Not an expert on funding formulas, but I have a lot of respect for Tammy Colby and her work, and Bruce Williams and his work at the national level. And they're both saying that the $13,200 base They don't think that that makes sense. They're thinking closer to $15,000. That needs to be got right. Whatever that number should be, and then the inflators on top of that. We need to make sure that's done well. We also need to make sure that any base amount and weighting formula would apply to all schools, whether independent or public, if they're utilizing public money. Governor's plan does do that. As we're thinking about any type of adjustments to that plan or any different type of plans that might come out, Health Ed's talk about having a bill, for example. We need to make sure that whatever we do does that. So we have this equitable system as possible. And I realize the governor's plan also tries to do that with the school choice concept they're proposing. I have a lot of questions about the school choice piece. I need to know more about that, so I'm not going to comment on that a lot. But he's seemingly acknowledging that some non-public schools that are currently receiving public funding probably should not be, and others that are doing all the things they're supposed to do should. And at the BPA, we fully support that. A big concern for us is how do we address the huge disparities in salaries across the state? One of my biggest concerns was moved to just 5 school districts. Sizes that much research indicates may be too big in terms of student outcomes, is how do we address those major differences? Now, I was the person here for years talking about having a statewide teachers membership. I still would love to see us get there some, but it can't happen overnight.
Statewide teachers, what?
Contract. That's not in my testimony. So for a lot of reasons, going from 119 to 5 doesn't make sense to me. And there's no research that supports the number 5. But in fairness to the AOE, that number just came from where the superintendent's meeting themselves. Even Zoe said in a meeting with a number of people that 5 is kind of a made up arbitrary number. So I don't think anybody thinks 5 is necessarily the right number. I don't think anybody really knows exactly what the right number is. So I think that's going to be part of the General Assembly to figure out what is the right number. Teachers working in the same district they're gonna want the same pay. And so if I had a district that ran from Richford up a Canadian border up near where I live, all the way to Shoreham, which is the 5 district plan. I mean, the disparities in those contracts is unbelievable. My last couple years as superintendent, we had just adopted Act 46. And prior to that, I combined the contracts of 5 different districts. Telling you, that was a ton of work. I was out 100 nights that year. The union was incredible. Everybody's working together. We got all the teachers on the same contract. We're talking about for a couple thousand kids. This here, we're talking for across the whole, almost a big chunk of the state. So I just think that's going to be too much too soon. I don't have a magic number about the size of districts. I heard Phil say above 5,000, you start getting diseconomies of scale. Research I've read in the past has always been about 10,000. So I trust Phil more than I do myself on that research. I think somewhere between 2,000 to 10,000 typically is a sweet spot. And I think it may vary depending on geography, some of the things that they articulated for. Maybe in one part of the state, it really should be a district of 3,000 kids. Maybe another part of the state having 6,000 would be absolutely fine in a district. If you're too small, I think Senator Bongar alluded to this, you're not going to have the opportunities for kids that a bigger district can provide. If you're too large, you're going to lose effectiveness, become less efficient, more bureaucratic, and the individual student might get lost. I also think it's going to be easier to combine contracts with close by neighbors than it will be across vast geographical areas. So I think the General Assembly should set those parameters with the metrics that you select in terms of what you think the right size should be, our demographics, our rurality, our tradition, whether it means you draw the lines or have somebody else draw the lines, present back to the General Assembly, and then you'll modify or approve. I think doing it that way, instead of moving into really large districts, will be more palatable to the average Vermonter. Local control really matters in the state. I think moving to larger districts makes sense, but moving into mega districts is going to be very hard for some people to swallow. And I think you're going to get a lot of pushback on that. And I think the decision should be at the local district level once that new board is formed, but not the town level. And that would mean that this new board, not a board of 5 over the spread that they're talking about here, but maybe you combine a couple of big districts in Franklin County and they become one district, just for example, where I live. If you did that, that new board would decide how we're going to repurpose schools if necessary, and we're going to keep schools open or not keep them open. They will make those decisions and have the authority to do that. You can't let one town have the authority of whether the school closes or not. Because if you do, if the school needs to close, it's not going to happen. Facilities are another major concern. if we're going to start from scratch, our system won't look like it today, right? We have large comprehensive high schools, large by Vermont standards, comprehensive middle schools, greater scale. We'd have abundance of CT offerings. It'd be great. Fortunately, we have facilities that we have. So some school construction is going to take place. This means that the state needs not only support school construction in theory, but also come up with some type of funding source to support that. And through that process, we, and by we, I mean you, as a General Assembly, are going to have to make some tough decisions. You know, where is new construction necessary? Where do you say, you know what, this building is outlived its usefulness. We're not going to spend taxpayers' dollars on this particular building. In some cases, it might be these 3 or 4 buildings. Instead, we're going to build one brand new high school or elementary school or middle school. A big concern for me to govern the plan, and the SBA talked about this as well, is moving many responsibilities away from the state board to the Agency of Education. I can talk about this both the rest of the day if you want. Suffice to say, I think we're better off with a commissioner model that we used to have. I think we're better off with an independent, neutral state board that a commissioner answers to, that works on behalf of all Vermonters, and answers to the General Assembly and the governor jointly. Right now, with an agency, they answer directly to the governor. This has nothing to do with this governor. I said this way before this governor was the governor. And I think the system we have right now makes it too much of a political animal. I especially think that in one of the only 2 states left that I know of that is a 2-year governor. I would much rather see education taken out of that political realm. I'd like to see you folks appoint 3-4 members, the House appoint 3-4 members, and governor appoint 3-4 members. Have a commissioner, and then that board directs the work of the commissioner and is focused on what's best for education, regardless of what's going on in the state. Almost done. Classroom size. So looking at research, my answers are a little different than the Superintendent's Association and maybe VSBA. If I was going to make a recommendation around class size, I would start with 15-ish, K1, 2, 3, being try to stay 15 or below if you can. If you have cases on average, if you have one class with 18, another with, 14, that's fine. But try to stay as small as we can in the elementary grades. But if you get much below 15, you lose a lot of ability as a teacher. A lot of people don't realize it. Teaching 7 kids, kids get sick of each other. It's hard to do anything. 15 kids, you can do lots of different types of groups. Then at the 4th to 8th grade level, I would say try to have on average 20 or less in classroom. You have classrooms of 17, classrooms of 22, fine. And at the high school level, I would say try to have 25 or less. To get more than 25, even at the high school level, it's pretty difficult.
So why in the middle school? Why couldn't that be the same? What's your?
A lot of people say that. When you look at the research in terms of student achievement, you'll see that the ideal number of middle school, they say, is between 18 and 22. And the researchers in support of that, John Hattie's research in the book called Visible Learning, which talks about effects. And he's one of those people that's not a big believer in class size. He says the class size does have impact, but not the impact that a lot of people will tell you that it does. Some people say if you've got 7 kids in a classroom, teachers can make incredible progress. I actually don't think that's true. But with middle school, because of the developmental needs of those kids, how they're all over the place, they suggest a little smaller number than high schools. Okay? You're welcome. And then at the end of this document, I did give you some research you guys can look at related to class sizes. And lastly, in terms of concerns, as a longtime superintendent, I'm surprised to hear me say this, but with 6 different school boards and weight committee board meetings, negotiation sessions, all that stuff that I did for years. But my wife said, you're going to do something different or you're not going to be my husband. I strongly oppose the idea of appointing 25 school board members and 5 boards for the entire state. I believe, Alan Gilbert say during one of our commissions on the future public education meetings, he was doing public comment. He made a comment that said there'd be more senators in Vermont than school board members. I hadn't thought about that. I first started planning. I was going, that to me, that's a bridge too far. I just think there's a polarity. There's way too many board members, which we had. We used to have more board members than we had cows at the time, and we have a lot less now. And how many boards, how many school board members should we have? I think the answer is not 119 boards we have right now. I also don't think it's 5. I think it's someplace in between. So we would not support having a situation where we only have 25 board members. I just think the public would be too cut out of public schools. I think the local control would be too lost. And I think as much as it is a pain for me sometimes to deal with as a superintendent, local control really matters. And we want our voters to be invested in democracy. We want to invest in their public schools. And the last thing about that could be considered, related to the plan, I did want to mention, I think we should get rid of supervisory unions. I've been saying that for a lot of years. They often create another layer of, scale and efficiencies that get lost in many cases. As an example, when I was a superintendent, if I had a teacher in Richford who was in her second year and was a rock star, and we had to rip her because budgetary needs or whatever, or declining enrollment, she was out of a job. Where if in a consolidated school district, which they didn't have when I was there, they are working, they have more of now. Now that teacher would be able to go to Unitsburg. Back then she couldn't. She'd have to reapply for the job and go through the whole process because it was a different employer. So by closing that scale down, the supervisory union model of me is kind of like the articles in the federation. It's like, well, we're all in this, but we might get taxes to it, we might not, we might follow the rules, we might not. You know, General Washington, you might want some more money for troops, but in the supervisory district, it's one employer and they're all, so you can move staff around if you have to and stuff like that.
So what do you think about evaluations of teachers? I'm thinking that, you know, if you got a teacher that's only been in it for 2 years, but she or he is a rock star.
Yeah.
I mean, we're short teachers. We're not looking to get rid of them, but we've also maybe have some that aren't performing to a standard.
Right.
So standardized valuations, you know, evaluated to your peers.
Oh, from your peers.
From your, well, no, not necessarily from your peers, but somebody needs to formally evaluate teachers, because we don't want somebody to move into the state and be held up because there's a teacher that's not performing that's holding her up. I brought that up 2 years ago to Dan French, and we didn't really get a good solid answer of who does the evaluations.
So the way it works right now, every teacher in their first 2 years by state law are supposed to be evaluated twice each year. Then after that, it's catch as catch can. It's done by each district level. It's poorly done in much of the state. Oftentimes, the principals are the ones that need to do the evaluations and they don't have the time to get them done, especially if they've got a number of new hires, because they've got to do those probationary teachers first. So you might be a mediocre teacher in your 5th, 6th, 10th year, and the principal might never even really get to evaluate you, which is a problem. We put together a task force, I don't know when, but Don Tenney, who's now president of Vermont EA, he and I were on it, but for the people, we wrote up this evaluation document for the state. I think it's still on our website. We cited all the research. We spent years putting it together. Armando Villaseca was in charge of the AOE at the time, and he was very supportive of it. And he left, and he got put on a shelf. I would love to have a standardized evaluation system for principals, superintendents, and teachers across the state. And if you want to pass along, if they need to develop it, I'd be interested.
I mean, it's a pain in the neck.
It's a pain in the neck, but it's important.
It's almost essential in this kind of
It is essential.
organization where, and then you know, we used to have you had your rater who was maybe the principal.
Yeah.
And then you had an interim rater and a senior rater, where everybody was taking a look at this individual's
Yeah.
performance and they're rating him according to their peers.
Yeah.
So, and then they actually had a senior rater profile where you didn't want to give too many teachers or whatever a top rating, because then that made your evaluation less impactful. So there is a process and it's right there, but if you know, because I said to Dan, so who does this? And our teacher's tenure, and he said, no, we don't tenure teach.
We really, in my opinion, we do.
Okay, so if you
Tenure
don't get an adverse,
Tenure means to me, after 2 years
you
in
don't
Vermont,
get an adverse evaluation.
you have to have, you gotta have just cause to remove me to non-renew me as a teacher.
Right.
Just cause is a fairly high, I think is a fairly high standard. Now, if I'm Vermont EA, I'm arguing that just cause is important, and I do think they have some rationale there. Because we have had situations in other states, but even in Vermont, where cases before unions were so powerful in Vermont, a principal might be in a situation where they're told they've got to cut their budget, and they look and they say, well, Mary and Susie are both about the same as teachers, but Mary's been teaching a lot longer, so we pay her more, so I'm going to evaluate her out. But no fair, just cause. So that's why seniority has such a hold there. So it's more complicated than in a private business world. But I would say teachers do have tenure after a certain period. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing or good thing, but I would say that they do have tenure.
I don't want to belabor it, but
I got to come in and talk about this.
no,
next time.
I do want to say that, you know, in the organization I was in, you're good, you know, this guy's a friend of mine, and even though he or she is a sub performer, really give him a good evaluation and then ship him on. We're gonna move a problem
Yeah.
from one place to another.
Somebody else.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that is a problem.
Okay.
So I may have brought that up to Secretary Saunders and her assistants for Vice Secretary, and they wrote it down.
Yeah.
So I think and I think somebody needs to keep those evaluations on record.
And they are up on record.
Okay.
Any district that does an evaluation on an employee, that gets put in the employee's personnel file. So that is always there. If I evaluate you and you're the head custodian, or if you're a bus driver and you happen to work for us, you know, you're an employee, not a contracted service.
Right.
Or a teacher or a principal, it is in your personnel file. So that the evaluation stay there, always stay there. Okay? Lastly, just a couple of advantages to improving scale. I know you guys know that. And I'm thinking like 20 to 30 districts, and that's just a number in my head. There's less suppression of standardized test data and other student results. So right now, a lot of times it's hard to tell how well schools are doing. Even though standardized tests, I'm not a big believer in them, they're only one piece of evidence. Right now, so much of our data gets suppressed in Vermont because we're so small. And our school districts are so small that we can't really look at the data. And so I think that's one advantage of having bigger systems. It's easier to move staff where student need is. The example I gave you of moving a teacher from Richford to Enosburg, you could do that. There's also protection of staff in a larger system as you remove programs due to declining enrollment. You can say to the teacher, listen, you know, we don't have this job for you anymore in Sheldon, but we've got an opening for you in Bakersfield, and it's the same district, and we can just move you over there. You know, and they get some protection that way. Boards are more likely to focus on budget, policy, goal setting, mission leading, and not getting into day-to-day management issues. That's a huge issue for VSBA, huge issue for superintendents. Good boards stay up here. And if you're a little bigger, it's easier to stay up here and not get so down into the minutia. And then lastly, it's easier, and to me, most importantly, it's an easier process for students to transition from one school to another within a larger district. So one of the reasons I supported Act 46, and in full disclosure, so you know this, a bunch of superintendents got in a room with Peter Kautz and Joey Donovan. And we wrote a bill called H883. I was in the room, helped write that bill. And it was basically saying take all SUs and make them into SDs. And then that passed the House, but didn't pass the Senate. And a couple of years later, we had Act 46. It was kind of like the compromise bill. We'll incentivize you. We'll give you money if you choose to do it. If you don't choose to do it, hit you with a stick. But if you decide to divorce afterwards, we'll take away the stick. And I don't think it really amounted to the things it could have. I was very frustrated because in my own communities, I would see kids in very rough poverty move from Richford to Enosburg to Berkshire and keep doing that cycle. And every school district had different rules, they had different curriculum, they had their own way of doing things. And so those poor kids were relearning all the time. Now we can't take care of all of that, but by having at least slightly bigger SDs, if you make them into SDs, then we can, because we could say, you know what, we don't need to make Joey change schools. You know, and the Kent Eventual Act did count for a lot of those families because they were renters that were moving, you know, they get kind of pushed out. Now they started renting in another place. So the rest of the year they could stay in that school. But the turnover for some of those kids would go to 7, 8 schools in an 8-year period. And we can fix that by having a little bit bigger districts. So that's what I got for prepared testimony, and I'll answer any other questions you might have.
I got one.
Yeah.
Is Miss Siglowski still on?
No.
Because she said something that really resonated with me, something about it was comparison, a correlation between poor performing schools and school boards.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that came, if it was unique to Vermont, it probably wasn't, but specific to Vermont, but if Act 46 might have created some of that. Because remember when we gave them a deadline, and a lot of school districts that knew it was coming really jumped on it and put it together some didn't. And I'm thinking that maybe the ones that kind of held back and didn't, were in jeopardy of not meeting the deadline, got thrown together.
I mean, I think there was some of that, I think, but the data I think she was talking about was national. And you look at the leadership data across the country, the number one indicator of a successful student outside of things that we don't control. I mean, obviously, if you're born and, you know, with a book in your hand, you're reading all the time, you're going to start school better. But number one is the teacher in front of them. Number two is the principal of the school, and it's very close. And the reason it's the principal is because they have impact on all the teachers in the school by evaluating them, providing learning in school. And I think that behind that is, you know, your superintendent and your school board, not sure what order they are, but the more your school has what we call DAC, BPA, direction, alignment, commitment, the better you're going to be. If everybody's heading the same direction, you're going to be better. If I'm incredible hard worker and I'm the principal and I think XYZ is the best reading program in the world, and you're the board and you all think, and you're hard workers, you think ABC is the best program, and we're fighting over what reading program to do. And, you know, the person really in charge is Will over there, who's actually in front of the kids. And he's like, I don't do ABC or XYZ. I'm doing EDF or whatever. No matter how hard we're all working, we're not making progress. And organizational leadership, if everybody's headed in the same direction, working together, that's when we find those beautiful things, whether it's Costco is a great example. That CEO is a genius. I mean, no way around it. Everybody's always pulling in the same direction. That's an organization. Covey Institute's another organization. Schools are like that too. There's those schools that are really focused, aligned, and working together. And then there are other places where everybody's working hard, but they're going in different directions.
Well, that's the goal there.
Yeah, go together.
Thank you. That,
You're very welcome.
your testimony was actually, so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, everybody. Scott, thank you.
So, we are done. Wow. Oh, I think so. You can go up one.